The convoy vanished in less than a minute, 36 ships blinking off the star maps as though they had never existed. One moment the families on Earth were watching their loved ones stream across the Helios rift in proud formation, screens filled with smiling faces and hopeful transmissions about fresh colonies and trade. The next moment there was static, alarms, and an empty silence so complete it seemed to press on the ears of every soul who heard it. Some said it was an attack. Others insisted it was a systems failure. A few comedians on Earth's late-night channels joked that maybe the convoy had found a shortcut to paradise and left the rest of humanity behind. No one laughed for long, because every camera replay confirmed the same thing. They were gone. And something had taken them. On the dreadnought that swallowed them whole, humans awoke disoriented, bruised, and staring through the bars of cages that stank of rust and alien musk. Children cried and mothers tried to hush them with trembling hands. Soldiers, stripped of their rifles, glared at the towering warlords who paraded past with tusked smiles and armor stitched with trophies. The captors laughed in guttural, metallic voices as they discussed the fate of their catch. Some of the convoy would be dissected for study, others auctioned off to black markets in distant galaxies. A select few would be displayed as exotic pets to amuse alien courts. Every prisoner understood in those first few hours that their chances of ever seeing Earth again had evaporated. And yet, among the cages, there remained an ember of belief that the government back home would send help. After all, humanity always rescued its own. Back on Earth, arguments filled the war rooms and broadcast halls. Some leaders called for negotiation, citing the need to prove humanity could be civilized and diplomatic in the galactic community. They suggested sending envoys with gifts and apologies, pretending the abduction was a cultural misunderstanding. Others demanded an immediate military strike, no matter the risks. Then there were the cynical voices who said it was better to cut losses, to mourn the convoy as martyrs and move on. One senator even tried to lighten the mood on live television, claiming the warlords probably just wanted to sample human cuisine. When he followed it with a wink in the line, "Let us hope they do not discover barbecue," half the audience groaned and the other half rioted. The final decision came not in public but in the shadows of Earth's high command. They sat in a sealed chamber deep beneath the surface, far away from public scrutiny. It was here that the conversation turned from saving lives to maintaining fear. The warlords were not the first enemy humanity had faced among the stars, and the high command had long since abandoned the illusion of mercy. The vote was swift, ruthless, and unanimous. They would not send a diplomat. They would not send an army. They would send him. On the dreadnought days passed in terror. Humans whispered to one another across cages, wondering when help would arrive. The warlords began their preparations for transport, feeding off the despair in their prisoners' eyes. One alien lord, broader than the rest and draped in chains of bone, mocked them openly, asking who Earth would send, a preacher or a clown. That was when a signal burst through the warlord comms like a spike of lightning. Unidentified object incoming. Velocity beyond standard intercept. The ship trembled with the impact of something colliding against its hull at impossible speed. Then silence again, heavy and waiting. The prisoners clutched each other, unsure whether this meant rescue or another doom. One child whispered to her mother that maybe it was an angel. A grizzled soldier muttered that it was probably the opposite. The warlords barked orders, sending squads into the corridors, claws and plasma blades at the ready. Laughter still echoed among them, though a nervous kind. After all, what could a single object do to their fortress the size of a continent? What was one man against an empire? The drop pod lay smoking in the docking bay, its surface scorched black, its insignia scorched even darker. A hiss of steam filled the air as the hatch groaned open. The first warlord squad charged forward, weapons raised. The figure inside did not rush to meet them. He stepped out slowly, one boot at a time, his armored silhouette casting a shadow that seemed larger than physics should allow. He did not carry a banner of peace. He did not carry the emblems of negotiation. He carried a blade that hummed with stored energy, and eyes that burned with something colder than hatred. The warlord shouted, demanded he kneel, demanded he identify himself. He said nothing at first, letting the silence drag like the edge of a knife. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, gravel pressed into iron. "I am not here to save. I am here to end." And with that, the docking bay exploded into screams and shrapnel as the first squad of warlords learned what Earth had truly sent. Not a savior. Not a soldier. An executioner. News of the figure spread quickly through the ship's dark halls, carried by both terrified warlords and desperate humans who clung to the rumor like a lifeline. Some called him Death Incarnate, others whispered the old name like a prayer and a curse. Cain Vera. The executioner. A man so feared among the colonies that parents used his name to frighten unruly children. His reputation was one of fire and ash, of victories bought in oceans of blood, of rescue missions where no prisoners returned to testify. The fact that Earth had chosen him meant only one thing. Humanity had given up on diplomacy. They had given up on saving everyone. They wanted a message written in annihilation. Inside their cages, the humans argued. Some cheered at the thought of the warlords finally being punished, imagining their chains broken by Cain's hand. Others wept quietly, knowing that if the stories were true, the executioner was as likely to kill them as he was to free them. One prisoner muttered that being rescued by Cain was like being saved from drowning by a shark. Another laughed bitterly and said at least the shark would be quick. Hope and terror mingled in equal measure, the air thick with uncertainty. For the first time since their capture, the prisoners did not know whether to pray for their rescuer to reach them or for him to be stopped before he did. The warlords themselves felt the tremor of unease ripple through their ranks. They had captured many species in their conquests, and most bent quickly under fear. But the human Earth had sent was something different. Something their databanks flagged with red warnings and fragmented reports of entire campaigns ended in silence. Their leaders tried to rally them with shouts of dominance and promises of glory, but deep in their alien marrow they knew they were no longer the hunters. They had become the prey. And so the game began, not of rescue but of extermination, as the executioner carved his path into the dreadnought's steel belly. Each step echoed with finality. Each shadow seemed to whisper that survival was no longer the goal. Cain had not come to save the convoy. He had come to erase the warlords from existence. And whether the prisoners liked it or not, they were caught inside the jaws of his mission. Cain Vera was not a man so much as a legend wrapped in flesh, and as he moved through the warlord dreadnought, the legend seemed to grow with every step. He did not hurry. He did not skulk in shadows. The executioner walked down the main corridors as though he owned them, his armored boots striking the deck plates with a rhythm that echoed like the tolling of a funeral bell. The warlords who first approached him came with laughter and jeers, certain that this lone intruder would be an easy prize. The laughter turned to choking gurgles when his blade sang once, and their bodies fell in pieces, limbs and torsos scattering across the metal floor. The prisoners who heard the distant clash could not see the carnage, but they could feel the ship tremble under the violence. Every clang of steel and roar of plasma was followed by silence, a silence that told its own grim story. Cain was a tall man, though not impossibly so, his frame built from years of combat, and scars both visible and hidden. His armor was battered but meticulously maintained, the kind of armor that had survived battles entire armies could not. Across its surface were etched marks of his own making, each line a tally of lives taken. His face, when revealed beneath the visor, was harsh and angular, eyes the color of cold metal and expression devoid of anything resembling mercy. To the humans watching him approach through half-broken surveillance feeds, he did not look like a savior. He looked like a storm wearing the shape of a man. And to the warlords he was worse than that, because storms could be outrun. Cain could not. The first real opposition came not from a handful of arrogant guards but from an organized squad of warlord soldiers, armed with plasma cannons and heavy shields. They blocked the corridor ahead of Cain, their commander shouting orders in a guttural growl. The executioner stopped walking, studying them as though measuring whether they were worth his time. Then, with the same calm he had shown from the moment he arrived, he launched himself forward. His blade cut through shields like paper, his movements precise and brutal, each swing designed to kill, not to impress. A plasma shot grazed his shoulder, hissing against his armor, but he didn't flinch. Within moments the corridor was a ruin of smoldering corpses, and Kane stood among them as if he had done nothing more strenuous than walk a flight of stairs. The commander died last, skewered to the wall with his own weapon, his final roar silenced by the executioner's hand. The humans imprisoned deeper within the ship were divided in their reactions. Some whispered prayers of gratitude, convinced that finally someone powerful enough had come to free them. Others trembled, recalling the stories of Kane's past missions, where those rescued sometimes did not live to tell their tale. They argued in hushed tones across their cages, some swearing he would never harm his own, others claiming Earth had not sent him for their lives but for something far darker. Hope warred with terror, leaving them restless, caught in a limbo of waiting. They could not decide whether they should be cheering for his progress or dreading the moment he arrived at their cell doors. For the Warlords, the situation was spiraling. Reports flooded their command deck of squads cut down, corridors drenched in blood, and surveillance feeds going dark one by one. The Warlord leaders bellowed with fury, demanding the intruder be captured alive so they could display his head as a trophy. Their underlings hesitated at the order, for none of them wanted to be the ones to face the executioner. Still, fear of their masters outweighed fear of Kane, and they deployed their elite guard units to stop him. It was a mistake they would not have the chance to repeat. Kane encountered the elite guard in the ship's lower hangar, a vast chamber filled with alien fighters and towering machinery. The guards were larger than the average warlord, bodies augmented with bone plating and chemical enhancers that made their veins glow with a sickly light. They rushed him with the speed of beasts, claws slashing and weapons humming. Kane did not retreat. He moved like a predator among them, using their momentum against them, twisting one into another, snapping bones with his bare hands when his blade was too slow. At one point, he drove an enemy headfirst into a docking console, causing an explosion that sent sparks raining down like a thunderstorm. He laughed once, low and humorless, at the sight of the chaos, and the sound made even his captives shiver. To see death laugh was something no one forgot. Meanwhile, the humans debated his intentions with more urgency. One older man who had been part of the Convoy's council insisted Kane would never leave them behind. Another, younger and bitter, pointed out the executioner's reputation for leaving nothing but ash behind him, even when humans were caught in the fire. Their argument grew heated until one prisoner, a woman who had lost her husband in the initial capture, snapped that it didn't matter what Kane's intentions were. He was here, and that meant someone had remembered them, even if remembering meant dying alongside their captors. Her words silenced the cages, the truth of them sinking like a stone. Whether they liked it or not, their fates were no longer their own. Back in the hangar, Kane stood alone among a field of alien corpses, his blade dripping with their lifeblood. He did not pause to rest. He simply looked up at the nearest surveillance node and spoke aloud, knowing the Warlords would hear him. I am Kane Vera. You know what I am. Surrender, and I will make it quick. Resist, and I will unmake this ship one room at a time. His voice carried no arrogance, no threat. It was a statement of fact, like declaring the sun would rise or a wound would bleed. The warlords on the command deck raged at his audacity, but beneath their fury ran a vein of fear. He was one man, and yet he was carving through their pride like it was made of clay. As he moved forward, Kane passed compartments filled with human prisoners. They pressed against the bars, calling out to him, begging him to release them. He spared them no more than a glance, his eyes cold, his focus elsewhere. One man shouted in anger that Kane was abandoning them. Another wept in relief just to see him alive. Kane's reply was simple and chilling. Survival is not my mission. Ending them is. The humans recoiled at his words, hope flickering like a candle in the wind. He kept walking, leaving them behind, his path already set. The dreadnought seemed to grow quieter as he advanced, as though the ship itself held its breath. Every alien step became hesitant, every human heart beat louder in the silence. Kane was not an army, but he was something worse. He was inevitability. The executioner had arrived, and nothing the warlords did would change what was coming. The dreadnought's corridors reeked of smoke, charred metal, and alien blood. Kane moved through the aftermath of his own destruction with the calm precision of a surgeon, every step measured, every strike before it perfectly calculated. He never wasted a movement. When squads rushed him, he dismantled them with methods that were both brutal and inventive. He pulled down ceiling panels to crush 3 warlords at once, twisted an enemy's arm until the plasma cannon it held fired backward into its own ranks, and turned maintenance drones into weapons of chaos by rewiring them mid-battle. To the humans watching through half-functioning surveillance feeds, it was both horrifying and mesmerizing. He was not just fighting. He was teaching the warlords what fear felt like when it wore human skin. It was during one such clash that Kane found himself surrounded in a service tunnel, 6 warlords pressing in from both ends. Their weapons hummed with deadly light, their eyes burning with the thrill of the hunt. Kane said nothing. He simply hurled a smoke charge at the ground, filling the narrow tunnel with choking haze. The warlords laughed at first, convinced he was hiding. But then the laughter turned to screams. The sound of blades slicing through bone echoed from the smoke, punctuated by the thud of collapsing bodies. When the haze cleared, Kane stood alone, his blade dripping, his armor scratched but unbroken. He did not celebrate. He simply kept walking, as if this massacre were no different than tying a knot or opening a door. Among the prisoners, the stories spread faster than the reality. Children whispered that the executioner could turn invisible, that he had eyes in the back of his head, that he drank alien blood to fuel his strength. Some adults corrected them, pointing out that Kane did not need tricks. He was simply efficient in ways that defied reason. Others tried to shut down the talk altogether, terrified that hoping in Kane meant they were hoping in the wrong thing. What none of them expected was that Kane, who seemed incapable of mercy, would one day stay his blade. The encounter came when he stumbled across a workshop buried in the ship's lower decks. Inside was not a warlord but a different alien, smaller, less imposing, hunched over a console filled with sparking wires. The creature froze when Kane appeared in the doorway, its wide, insect-like eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Kane's blade rose automatically, but the alien raised its hands in frantic surrender, chittering in broken human tongue. Not warlord, it cried. Servant, engineer, slave. Kane narrowed his eyes, studying the trembling figure. His instincts told him to kill it and move on. But something in the way the alien's mandibles clicked nervously, or perhaps the way its workbench was littered with schematics of sabotage against its own masters, made him pause. Against his usual doctrine, Kane lowered the blade. The alien introduced itself as Tyrus, though its pronunciation sounded like the grinding of gears. It was no warrior. It despised the warlords who had conquered its people and forced it into servitude. Tyrus claimed to know the dreadnought's layout better than any warlord officer, and insisted it could guide Kane through secret maintenance shafts that would take him closer to the ship's core. Kane did not trust easily, and he made that clear. If Tyrus betrayed him, the executioner promised to make the alien's death a slow lesson in pain. Tyrus nodded so violently its head seemed ready to snap. Better a human's monster than a warlord's leash, it muttered bitterly. And so, for the first time, Kane found himself with a companion, however reluctant. Their alliance was anything but smooth. Tyrus complained constantly about Kane's methods, insisting that blasting through armored doors or gutting every guard was wasteful compared to subtle sabotage. Kane, in turn, ignored most of the protests, reminding Tyrus that his mission was extermination, not efficiency. Their exchanges often bordered on dark comedy, a bizarre duet of relentless brutality and exasperated logic. At one point, Kane ripped a power conduit from the wall and electrocuted an entire squad at once, leaving their twitching corpses smoking on the deck. Tyrus groaned aloud. "You could have just tripped the breaker." Kane responded without missing a step. "I like my way better." Despite the bickering, the partnership bore results. Tyrus guided Kane into areas of the ship he might never have reached alone, showing him shortcuts through ventilation shafts and maintenance tunnels. In return, Kane kept Tyrus alive when warlord patrols appeared, cutting them down with terrifying ease. The prisoners soon learned of this unexpected companion, and their whispered debates grew even more fevered. Some believed Tyrus would betray Cain at the first opportunity. Others argued the executioner was cunning enough to use even an enemy to his advantage. No one could decide which possibility was more terrifying. The tension among the captives reached a breaking point when Cain finally spoke to them again. He had cut through another wave of guards and paused near the cages, Tyrus muttering in the background about how pointless the bloodbath had been. The humans pressed against the bars, begging Cain to free them. A woman asked if he had come to rescue them, her voice trembling with hope. Cain's answer chilled the air. I am here to finish the Warlords. Whether you live or die depends on how far you stay out of my way. His words struck like a hammer, shattering the fragile hope many had clung to. Murmurs spread through the cages, some condemning him as a monster, others clinging to the notion that even a monster was better than being slaves forever. That night, or what passed for night in the endless artificial cycles of the dreadnought, the prisoners argued. Some began plotting to aid Cain in whatever way they could, hoping he might spare them if they proved useful. Others whispered of mutiny, of somehow stopping him before he carried them all into the abyss with his ruthless mission. One man spat the words that echoed in the silence. He is not here to save us. He is here to erase them. If we get caught in the fire, so be it. No one could refute him, and the grim acceptance settled like a shroud. Cain himself was not oblivious to their fear, but it changed nothing. He was a weapon, and weapons did not seek permission to strike. Tyrus, however, began to see something else in him. Behind the relentless violence and cold declarations, there was a weight Cain carried, something unspoken that twisted his silence into something heavier than cruelty. Tyrus never asked, but it began to wonder if the executioner hated his enemies as much as he hated himself. The dreadnought was alive with fear now, its warlord masters growing more desperate by the hour. The executioner was carving his way not just through their defenses but through their pride, through the very core of their identity as conquerors. Cain had become their nightmare, a force they could neither predict nor contain. And with Tyrus at his side and the human prisoners caught between dread and hope, the warlords began to realize the truth. They were no longer the rulers of this ship. They were cattle waiting for slaughter, and the butcher had already begun his work. The warlords had grown tired of reports filled with losses and excuses. Their command deck vibrated with fury as their generals shouted over one another, tusks gnashing, fists pounding on steel tables. The intruder had cut down their squads, humiliated their champions, and still marched forward, dragging behind him the shadow of inevitability. They could not allow this single human to unravel the fear they had spent centuries cultivating across the stars. So they unleashed the weapons they kept for wars, not for one man. Monstrous beasts bred in their laboratories, hulking brutes spliced from a dozen predator species, were released into the ship's halls. Alongside them came the champions, warriors genetically and mechanically enhanced, each towering twice Cain's height and carrying weapons that could gut a tank. It was a gamble born of desperation, but desperation was all they had left. Cain met the first of the beasts in an engine chamber lit with the pulsing glow of plasma cores. The creature had 12 eyes, each glowing like embers, and a jaw that split into 4 serrated parts. It lunged with speed that belied its size, claws tearing through steel as though it were cloth. Cain stood his ground. His blade cut one arm clean from its socket, but the beast barely slowed, roaring as black blood sprayed across the walls. The fight that followed was chaos given form, the chambers shuddering under their clash. At one point, Cain used a maintenance wrench as a weapon, driving it through the creature's skull with such force that the sound echoed like thunder. When the beast finally fell, twitching and broken, Cain pulled the wrench free, wiped the gore on his armor, and muttered dryly that it was good for more than fixing pipes. Tyrus, who had been watching from a safe distance, groaned in disbelief and muttered that Cain's methods defied every logical standard of combat. Cain only shrugged and walked on. The champions were no less formidable. Cain faced one in the hydroponics bay, a towering brute with mechanical arms grafted to its shoulders and a plasma whip that cracked with deadly arcs. The fight turned the lush greenery into ash as flames spread from ruptured pipes. Cain endured blow after blow, his armor dented, his breath ragged, yet his strikes never faltered. He waited for the exact moment the champion's whip wrapped around a support beam, then yanked it tight, dragging the massive warrior off balance. In that instant, Cain drove his blade through its chest and let it collapse into the burning vegetation. He staggered for only a moment before pressing forward again. His body absorbed pain as if it were fuel, as though each wound only sharpened his focus. The humans in the cages heard of these battles through rumors carried by guards and whispered among themselves. For them, Cain's victories were both inspiring and terrifying. They marveled at his ability to bring down creatures and warriors that no ordinary human could even imagine fighting. But the more they heard, the more they began to question what kind of man could endure such battles and keep walking without pause. Some whispered that Cain was no longer truly human, that Earth had remade him into something else entirely. A mother clutched her child and whispered that he was like a storybook monster, a beast dressed as a man, and she was no longer sure whether to fear him or beg him for protection. Tyrus, for all its cynicism, began to learn more of Cain as they traveled together. Between battles, in the rare moments of quiet, Cain revealed fragments of his past. He spoke little, but Tyrus was sharp enough to piece together the truth. Once, Cain had been an ordinary soldier, loyal to commanders who betrayed him in the heat of war. Left for dead on a battlefield of ashes, he had been taken by Earth's high command and remade into a weapon. What emerged from their experiments was not simply a soldier but something colder, harder, and far less bound by human morality. Cain did not fight for nations or for people. He fought because it was all that remained of him, and Earth used him because he was effective. Tyrus listened in silence, its alien features unreadable. Finally, it muttered that Cain was less a man than a warning, a creature forged not by destiny but by cruelty. Cain did not respond. His silence was its own admission. The prisoners meanwhile reached a dangerous crossroads. A group of them began to believe Cain could not be allowed to continue unchecked. They whispered among themselves, voices filled with panic and resentment, and finally resolved to act. One night, as Cain passed their cages, a small band of desperate men tried to overpower him. They had scavenged tools and broken metal scraps, convinced that numbers might give them a chance. Cain did not hesitate. In the blink of an eye, he cut two of them down, his blade slicing through flesh and bone as easily as it had the Warlords. Another man he slammed against the bars so hard his spine snapped. The others froze in horror, realizing too late that their rebellion had not freed them but condemned them. Cain wiped the blood from his blade and stared at the survivors through the bars. "You think I am your enemy," he said flatly. "You are mistaken. I am worse than your enemy. I am necessary." Then he turned and left them in silence, the echoes of their fallen companions heavy in the air. That moment shattered the last illusions the prisoners had about their rescuer. Some broke down sobbing, others clung to hope with a desperation that bordered on madness. A few still tried to convince themselves that Cain's brutality was aimed only at those who stood in his way, but even they could not deny the truth. The executioner was not here to save them. He was here to finish his mission, no matter the cost. The warlords grew more frantic as their champions and beasts failed. Their arrogance cracked, their confidence bled out of them like air from a ruptured hull. They threw more forces at Cain, but the outcome was always the same. Corpses piled higher, blood slicked the floors, and Cain pressed ever deeper into their ship. Their once proud dreadnought now felt like a coffin, every corridor a narrowing path toward their inevitable end. Fear, a weapon they had wielded so long against others, was turned back upon them with merciless precision. Tyrus, walking at Cain's side, could not help but see the larger picture. Cain was not merely dismantling the warlords' army. He was unraveling the very myth of their dominance. Every fallen beast, every slain champion, every shattered squad sent a message across the dreadnought. The warlords were not invincible. They could bleed. They could die. And one man, one human, was enough to prove it. For Tyrus, the realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. For the prisoners, it was a reminder that their fate was no longer in their own hands. They were passengers on a ship already set to burn, and their executioner was the one holding the torch. The dreadnought groaned like a wounded beast, its corridors littered with the remnants of squads sent to stop the executioner. Kane pressed deeper, his path guided by Tyrus, whose jittery steps betrayed unease despite its insistence that it knew every vent and maintenance shaft. The alien muttered constantly, warning Kane about hidden security systems, chiding him for smashing through doors instead of disabling them, and complaining about the smell of scorched metal and blood that followed in his wake. Kane barely acknowledged the chatter, his attention fixed on the beating heart of the ship. He knew what lay ahead. It was not rescue, not salvation. It was annihilation. And for Kane, that was enough. When Tyrus finally revealed the full map of the Dreadnought's power systems, the scale of Kane's intention became clear. The ship was not just a prison, it was the spearhead of a fleet, tethered to supply lines and command channels that reached far beyond the Helios Rift. Destroying it would cripple the Warlords not only in battle but in morale. Tyrus explained that the core could be overloaded, a chain reaction tearing through the ship's systems until nothing remained but drifting wreckage. But it also warned that the explosion would be impossible to escape. Kane listened in silence, studying the plans, then nodded once as though the certainty of death meant nothing. Tyrus sputtered in disbelief. "You would kill them, you would kill yourself, you would kill everything on this vessel." Kane's reply was calm, almost casual. "That is the plan." His words struck Tyrus like a blade, and for a moment the alien considered fleeing then and there. But Kane's presence was gravity itself, and Tyrus knew there was no escaping him. The prisoners learned of the plan through whispers carried by guards who had overheard fragments of Kane's conversations. The revelation sent ripples of panic through the cages. Some collapsed in despair, realizing they were not meant to be rescued at all. Others clung to desperate denial, insisting Kane would change his mind or find a way to save them. A few, hardened by their suffering, accepted the truth with grim resolve. Better to die free than to live as trophies for the Warlords. The divisions among them deepened, the arguments rising until they nearly came to blows, but all were united in one thing. Their fate no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the executioner. The Warlords, meanwhile, realized the intruder's goal. Intelligence feeds confirmed his trajectory toward the core, and for the first time the alien commanders faced the possibility of their own destruction. They redoubled their efforts, sending wave after wave of soldiers into his path, but each one was slaughtered with the same relentless efficiency. The Warlords grew desperate enough to offer rewards for Kane's capture, promising unimaginable riches and glory to anyone who succeeded. Few took the offer seriously. Even the most hardened warriors had begun to fear the very thought of facing him. Whispers spread through the lower ranks, whispers of a human specter who carved through armies and smiled at death. Their discipline wavered, their courage faltered, and the dreadnought itself seemed to sag beneath the weight of their dread. Then Tyrus made its move. The alien had weighed the odds, considered the certainty of death, and decided that betrayal was the only path to survival. It slipped away during a brief skirmish, scuttling through vents until it reached the Warlord commanders. There, trembling and desperate, it offered to lead them to Kane, to show them his weaknesses, to give them the chance to strike first. The Warlords listened with interest, amused by the alien's cowardice, and agreed to let Tyrus live, so long as it delivered. But as quickly as the bargain was made, the Warlords revealed their own duplicity. They locked Tyrus in restraints, planning to use it as bait for Kane. The alien's protests filled the command deck, its voice shrill with indignation. "You promised. You promised." The Warlords laughed, tusks glinting, and reminded Tyrus that promises were for slaves, not masters. Kane was not surprised when he found Tyrus surrounded by guards in a holding chamber. He had known betrayal was inevitable, yet he had allowed Tyrus to stay with him anyway. The alien blinked in shock when Kane appeared, its mandibles clicking in a mix of shame and relief. "You knew," Tyrus muttered. "You knew I would do this." Kane's eyes were cold as stone. "Everyone betrays eventually. The only question is when." The guards did not live long enough to hear more. Kane cut them down in a blur of steel, then broke Tyrus free from its restraints. Tyrus slumped to the floor, muttering that trusting humans was folly. Kane did not argue. He simply turned back toward the core, his path unchanged. But something had shifted among the prisoners. For weeks they had been trapped in despair, waiting for death. Now, hearing of Kane's capture and sudden return, something inside them snapped. The executioner had shown them that fear could be wielded, that courage could be madness dressed as determination. And so, against all odds, the prisoners rose up. They overpowered distracted guards, armed themselves with stolen weapons, and launched a chaotic revolt. It was clumsy, unorganized, and many died within minutes. But the act itself changed the tide. The dreadnought shook with the noise of rebellion, alarms wailing as chaos spread through the ship. The prisoners were no longer silent cattle. They had become fire in the dark. Kane, shackled briefly before tearing free, smirked at the sound of the uprising. He had counted on it. Everything he had done, every corpse left behind, every whispered rumor, had been part of his plan to ignite the humans' rage. They were not soldiers, but desperation gave them a strength that surprised even their captors. Kane moved among the revolt like a phantom, cutting through warlord reinforcements and steering the chaos toward the core. The prisoners shouted his name now, some with reverence, others with fear, but it did not matter. They were fuel for his strategy, a distraction as vital as any weapon. The warlords enraged, threw their full might into suppressing the rebellion. But for every squad they crushed, another rose. For every cage they locked, another was broken open. The ship became a battlefield too vast to control, and at its center was the executioner, relentless as ever. The irony was not lost on him. The humans believed they were fighting for freedom, for a chance to return home. In truth, they were fighting to buy him time to end it all. Kane knew they would not thank him when the ship burned. They would curse his name with their final breaths. But Kane did not need gratitude. He needed completion. By the time Kane reached the final corridors leading to the core, the dreadnought was in flames. Smoke filled the halls, corpses of warlords and humans alike littered the ground, and still the battle raged behind him. Tyrus stumbled after him, muttering that everything was madness, that nothing about this mission made sense. Kane did not slow, his voice steady even as explosions rocked the ship. Sense is irrelevant. Purpose is not. And his purpose had never been rescue. It had always been execution. The final corridors to the dreadnought's core were a labyrinth of steel and fire. Alarms blared, flames licked along ruptured conduits, and the air tasted of ash and blood. Kane advanced without hesitation, his armor scorched, his blade dripping, his body carrying wounds that would have killed any ordinary man. Behind him trailed Tyrus, stumbling and muttering in disbelief at every step. The alien could not fathom why Kane kept going, why he pressed forward with such certainty when even victory meant destruction. But Kane was not driven by hope or survival. He was driven by inevitability, and inevitability did not negotiate. The warlords made their last stand at the threshold of the core chamber. Dozens of champions stood shoulder to shoulder, their armor glowing with energy shields, their weapons humming with lethal promise. Behind them loomed the warlord lords themselves, tusked monstrosities wrapped in gilded plating, symbols of conquest etched across their chests. Their voices shook the chamber as they roared promises of Kane's death, swearing that his head would hang above their throne. Kane listened in silence, his expression carved from stone. Then, with the calm of a man lighting a fuse, he lifted his blade and walked straight into them. The clash was thunder given form. Plasma blasts seared the air, warlord war cries shook the steel walls, and Kane carved a path through them like fire tearing through dry brush. Every swing of his blade was deliberate, each strike ending a life. He did not dance or weave. He endured. He let their blows hammer against his armor, allowed his body to bleed, and in return he gave only death. One champion roared as it drove a spear into his side, but Kane caught the shaft, snapped it in half, and drove the jagged edge through its skull. Another crashed down with a war hammer that cratered the floor, but Kane rolled free and severed its legs before it could lift the weapon again. The lords themselves joined the fight, their bulk shaking the chamber as they descended upon him, tusks gnashing, claws slashing. Kane bled more than ever before, his breath ragged, his body screaming in protest. But the executioner was not a man built to survive. He was a man built to finish. Tyrus cowered at the edge of the battle, its insect eyes wide with shock as it watched Cain dismantle the monsters it had feared its whole life. The alien whispered to itself, half in awe, half in terror. He cannot be killed. He does not die. He kills death itself. And still, part of Tyrus wondered if Cain was fighting the Warlords or fighting something deeper inside himself, something that no blade could ever cut away. At last the final Warlord Lord fell, its body crashing to the floor with a sound like a collapsing tower. Cain stood over it, drenched in blood, his own and his enemies', his chest heaving with exhaustion. The path to the core lay open. The humming chamber beyond glowed with blinding energy, the dreadnought's heart pulsing like a star in chains. Cain staggered forward, leaving behind a trail of crimson footprints, and Tyrus followed reluctantly, muttering that this was madness beyond madness. Inside the chamber, Cain studied the core's control systems. He knew what to do. Detonating it would ripple through the ship and beyond, tearing the fleet's lifeline apart. But it would also consume everyone inside. The prisoners, the warlords still fighting, even Tyrus. Perhaps even himself. For the first time, Cain hesitated. Not from fear, but from the weight of choice. He had never paused in his mission before. He had always been execution, pure and unyielding. Yet now, surrounded by echoes of dying humans who had looked to him with hope and terror alike, he found himself standing at a crossroads he had not expected. Tyrus, panting and trembling, saw the hesitation and seized it. "Do not do this," it begged. "There are ways to disable the core without total destruction. We could flee. We could survive." Cain turned his gaze on the alien, eyes like shards of frozen steel. Survival was never the mission. Tyrus shrank back, its mandibles clattering in despair. Then, to its surprise, Cain added, "But perhaps death does not have to be absolute." His hands moved across the controls, not to trigger the explosion immediately, but to alter its spread. He redirected power lines, shifted conduits, and rerouted containment fields. It would not save everyone. It could not. But it would carve a narrow window, a slim chance for some to escape if they seized it. It was not mercy. It was strategy. Yet for the humans who lived, it would look like salvation. The prisoners, still fighting in the outer halls, suddenly found doors unlocking, alarms flashing escape routes, and corridors leading toward shuttle bays. Many died before reaching them, but some survived, pushing through the chaos with desperate strength. They did not know Cain had engineered the opening. They thought it was luck or divine intervention. They thought perhaps the executioner had changed his mind. None of them realized that for Cain, it was never about their lives. It was about the completeness of his mission. Saving a few cost him nothing. Letting them think it was rescue cost him even less. When the core finally began to collapse, the dreadnought shook as though gripped by an earthquake. Explosions ripped through its spine, fire blossomed through its decks, and the Warlord fleet in orbit panicked as the command ship tore itself apart. In the chaos, human prisoners scrambled onto shuttles and fled into the rift, carrying with them stories that would burn across the stars. They would say the executioner had come not just to kill but to save. They would say he was both monster and miracle. They would say his blade had carved a path to freedom. But Cain was not among them. Tyrus, stumbling through the flames, shouted for him, begged him to flee, but when it turned back, he was gone. The last sight it had was of him standing before the core, motionless, as if waiting for the inevitable fire to claim him. Then the blast consumed everything, a blinding eruption that tore the dreadnought into fragments, and left the Warlord fleet crippled and broken. When the survivors returned to Earth, they were met with cheers and tears. Families embraced those who had escaped, governments praised the triumph, and the legend of the executioner grew even darker. Official reports called it a rescue. The whispers among the survivors called it something else. They said Cain had not come to save them. He had come to end the Warlords. Their survival was only a byproduct of his mission. And yet, in those whispers, there was awe as much as fear. For whatever else he was, Cain had proven that even the mightiest enemies could fall to a single human who refused to stop. As for Cain himself, no body was ever found. Some claimed he perished in the explosion, finally consumed by the fire he had carried for so long. Others swore they saw a shadow slip into the rift before the ship imploded, vanishing into the void to await the next war that demanded his presence. And so the executioner became more than a man. He became a story, a myth told in hushed voices around campfires and on distant colonies, a reminder that humanity did not send saviors into the dark. It sent monsters. And sometimes, monsters were exactly what survival required.